Hi everyone, how's it going? Well, for the past few days, I've been revising what'll almost certainly be my last publication that I put together before finishing up my PhD in my lab, and also putting together a list of experiments I definitely would have loved to have pursued if I were still in the lab. And it's sort of a nice reminder of how fun it is to just come up with ideas for experiments. Like for me, that's the best part. It's sort of like putting together like a Christmas list to send to Santa Claus or something like that. It's just like let your imagination and curiosity run wild, right? So I just thought I'd share that little tidbit in case anyone who sees this is interested in going to science. It really is quite fun to conceive of potential experiments, particularly if you're not necessarily going to be the one who has to struggle through them. Anyways, that's what I've been up to. I've been keeping an eye on what we're learning regarding any potential neurological ramifications of COVID-19, and I discussed some of the recent progress in trying to understand those ramifications last week and a few weeks before then, right? So, well, guess what just came out? A couple days ago, actually. So a study was published in The Lancet, which is a pretty prominent and long-lived medical journal based out of the UK. And this study tracked the most common neurological symptoms that people who were admitted to hospitals in the UK exhibited. So it's important to keep in mind, though, that these are the people that were included in this study were identified as being particularly severe cases. So, it's not like evaluating the potential neurological ramifications of developing COVID-19 in general, for most people. It's focusing on whether there may be consistent neurological or neuropsychiatric issues that tend to arise among the people who have particularly severe reactions to COVID-19. And so before we dive too deep, I think it's worth exploring a bit of the rationale for even thinking that the brain or the nervous system might be affected by COVID-19. And so just for some context, regarding why that would even be a question. During the emergence of past pandemics, including SARS, caused by a similar coronavirus, which happened in the early 2000s, MERS, about a decade later, also caused by a coronavirus, and H1N1, there were reports of patients exhibiting neurological symptoms, just in general. I discussed in greater depth a few months ago, on April 5th, I'm pretty sure, neurological symptoms that had been noted by physicians in multiple countries, including China, Italy, and our beloved United States. As I mentioned, a hospital in Italy, which ended up experiencing sort of a very severe spike in COVID-19 cases, there was a hospital that ended up devoting an entire unit to caring for COVID-19 patients who exhibit neurological symptoms, things like strokes, seizures, and sort of just symptoms that are kind of reminiscent of encephalitis. And encephalitis is just a word that's used by physicians to describe any source of inflammation in the brain. A bunch of things can cause encephalitis, and it's theoretically possible that it might come about by some sort of indirect reaction to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 rather than the virus itself being able to gain entry to the brain. But anyways, I don't want to repeat too much from the past streams, but there were specific components of those early reports that began to catch my attention. And so, for example, there are reports of confusion as being one of the symptoms consistent enough to ultimately be included in things to keep an eye out for in Italy. And then a bit later, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC here in the US, also added confusion to the list of potential symptoms. And so there's been a thread of people who develop COVID-19 who seem to also lose olfactory sensitivity, meaning their ability to smell and also often their ability to taste as well become just disrupted. And so when those reports first came out, to be perfectly candid, it struck me as being sort of unsurprising. You have a severe respiratory infection, and our ability to taste and smell rely on at least a bit of respiratory capabilities. And then of course there was the timing of the emergence of this thing, which was in the spring, or at least it was continuing to emerge sort of in the spring here in the U.S. And a lot of people's allergies begin sort of acting up around that time of year, and they can potentially obstruct respiration on their own, right? Just allergies. So I didn't really have like a strong opinion about it. I just sort of took note, and I know a lot of other folks in basic neuroscience research did the same. But then a study was published by a fairly gigantic group in Hong Kong. That it was about like a month ago, that discusses this specific symptom, like the olfactory symptoms. And so, there's a ton of authors on that paper, but they only had like 18 COVID-19 patients and 18 controls. So it wasn't like a gigantic sample size of patients. But they reported that just under 70% of the COVID-19 patients reported some kind of olfactory symptom. And interestingly, they also noted that there was a subset of patients who didn't seem to exhibit like classical respiratory symptoms, things like coughing, wheezing, chest pain, like shortness of breath, that kind of thing. All the stuff that you basically heard like from the beginning that were associated with COVID-19. But those people did exhibit olfactory dysfunction or anosmia, which is like a significant disruption or complete loss of the ability to smell. And again, it can also affect taste. So I won't go too deeply into that particular study's components because like they did some pretty old school histology, with things like H&E stains, and you have biopsies and stuff like that. And frankly, it's been a bit too long since I had to go through like pathology classes for me to like try and scrutinize their microscopy. So the only thing I think is worth noting is just that a pretty substantial proportion of the patients they observed exhibited this olfactory dysfunction. And about a month before that study came out, so about 2 months ago, a group out of San Diego in California, here in the U.S., also noted that people who showed up with symptoms that looked like the flu, who also had some kind of disruption of smell or taste, they tended to be the people who tested positive for COVID-19. So there are some like popular press articles, meaning like articles that are written for people outside of science, and more importantly, they're not peer-reviewed, that discuss like a potential explanation for this disruption of taste and olfaction, but frankly, like these really shouldn't be discussed yet, and maybe I'll touch on why I feel that way in a second. But anyways, so back to this UK study, right, evaluating the frequency of neurological symptoms in COVID-19 patients. So this study, once again, was published in The Lancet, and I could go on about what's happened in The Lancet recently, but this study focused on like 153 patients who were selected because they seemed to be experiencing particularly like severe reactions to COVID-19. And something that's kind of cool about this study is that this network of physicians and scientists use an online tool by which all the physicians like all over the country could report their findings very efficiently. And so they were basically like all posting their findings to like a shared collection of findings. And this enabled them to work together far more efficiently than if they were just working independently. And I only highlight that because in the US, unless scientists or physicians or physician scientists like have their own personal networks with others in various states across the country, I'm like unaware of any similar type of collaborative effort or platform to enable this kind of thing. I mean, it may exist, but I haven't heard of one, and I think I probably would have if it did exist. So this network of clinicians throughout the UK, they were taking notes about whether their patients, who once again were ones that were exhibiting severe reactions to COVID-19, were exhibiting like a variety of brain or nervous system related symptoms. So again, these are things like strokes, altered personality, behavior, cognition, stuff like that. Numbness, or just like things in general that struck them as being like potentially neurological. And so, to sum up what they were doing, there's a quote from the lead author of the study, and he's at the University of Liverpool, Dr. Benedict Michael, said that there were, quote, there have been growing reports of an association between COVID-19 infection and possible neurological or psychiatric complications, but until now, these have typically been limited to studies of 10 patients or fewer. Ours is the first nationwide study of neurological complications associated with COVID-19. But it is important to note that it is focused on cases that are severe enough to require hospitalization, right? So it's a bigger study than we've seen before. And it's also worth noting that the study included people in their COVID-19 cohort according to the following criteria. So a PCR-based test for the presence of COVID-19 and a PCR polymerase chain reaction. That's basically what most people are referring to when they say like COVID-19 testing. It's not the only kind of test, but generally speaking, that's probably what people are referring to. And so this cohort of their sample of COVID-19 patients, that criteria represented like the vast majority of the group. Okay, but then the study also included patients who underwent like chest x-rays or CT scans, who exhibited results that had become like confidently associated with COVID-19. And then they also included patients who had symptoms that were the hallmarks of the disease, but tests were either negative or they just weren't performed. And that probably sounds a little strange, but it's worth keeping in mind that PCR tests can't be 100% accurate as much as we'd like them to be. And they are pretty accurate, but they're not 100% accurate. And, this group who, tested negative or weren't tested, it was only 5 of them. So 5 out of 153 total people. Also, an unfortunate limitation, not gigantic, but a limitation nonetheless. They only had like comprehensive clinical profiles for 125 of the 153 patients, right? So, so here's what they observed. So the most common neurological symptom or issue was stroke. So in 77 of the 125, thoroughly evaluated patients, and most of these strokes were ischemic, meaning that something like a blood clot or some plaque buildup ended up blocking some blood vessels in the brain, which prevents blood delivery to those blocked regions, right? That's one of the ways that folks have strokes. And, some of them also did have hemorrhagic strokes, where like a blood vessel in the brain ruptures and, basically your brain is bleeding. And depending on where in the brain that rupture occurs, similarly to where a blocked vessel occurs, you'll have different kind of manifestations of stroke. And so also, unfortunately, only 74 of the patients in the study had their ages recorded, which is like super unfortunate, but the majority of them were over 60 years old. Okay, so 39 of the patients exhibited confusion or altered behavior that was associated with some kind of problem within the brain. And 23 of the patients had symptoms associated with psychiatric conditions, like mood-associated psychiatric conditions. And, they note in the paper that some of the patients may have had underlying conditions prior to exposure to COVID-19 in the first place that just hadn't been diagnosed or hadn't become a problem yet. So of those 23 patients, right, who were exhibiting psychiatric symptoms, 10 were exhibiting psychosis, which is like a pretty severe condition, and 6 of them exhibited symptoms of dementia. Okay, so of the 39 patients who with altered mental states, right, about half of them were actually under 60 years old. And the authors on the paper note that the prevalence of, and I think this is a really, really good point, so credit to them for picking, for including this in the paper. So they note that the prevalence of this younger group of people exhibiting these symptoms, again, diagnosed with psychiatric conditions, that might have been due to younger patients just being more likely to be referred to psychiatrists, while confusion or other similar types of like brain-related symptoms in older patients might be more likely to just be referred to neurologists. So it might just be the case that they were more sensitive to psychiatric conditions among younger patients. And so the reason I thought it might be worth discussing this paper is a study out of China about 4 days ago, right, that showed a correlation between people who were prescribed statin drugs. So statin drugs are some of the most widely prescribed medications, and they're prescribed to reduce cholesterol levels principally, like Lipitor you might have heard of. Those people who were prescribed those drugs tended to be associated with less severe overall reactions to COVID-19. So I don't want to go too deeply into that study because it is truly just like correlational, but it struck me as being potentially interesting given that strokes seem to be unusually frequent among patients with severe COVID-19, at least in the UK. And so, to be totally clear, this study that came out of China didn't provide any evidence that statins or any of the other drugs that they evaluated, which were ACE2 inhibitors, have any preventative effects on the severity of COVID-19 reactions. Like, that's not what they're proving. so they didn't prove a causative relationship, in other words. So there was just a correlation that they noted, and it's something that I'm sure physicians and scientists will be recording, taking note of moving forward throughout the rest of the world. So interesting findings, right? Just more evidence that there might be some neurological consequence of COVID-19 that may not be particularly intuitive. So another thing that I wanted to go into, and I sort of hinted at this when I was talking about the Lancet, or not so much the Lancet, but popular press coverage of COVID-19. I wanted to go into what I think is going to be a gigantic problem with how the biomedical community is confronting COVID-19, specifically the number of published papers that have already been retracted. This virus has only been around for a few months. It's only existed for a few months, to the best of our knowledge, obviously. But, an alarming number of papers have had to be retracted for a variety of reasons. And, beyond that, the consistent coverage in the popular press of preprint scientific articles, meaning articles that haven't yet undergone peer review by scientists in relevant fields, it's starting to freak me out a little bit because, I feel like almost more often than not at this point, when I see an article about COVID-19, some study of COVID-19, it's covering a preprint article that's available in places like BioRxiv, and these are really fabulous repositories, really fabulous tools, but I think they're just being misused, and perhaps just misunderstood. So it would sort of be like if someone interviewed a star, football quarterback about what it was like to win the Super Bowl, 2 months before, the game even happened, right? It's totally possible that this quarterback will be on the winning team, and, we have every reason to believe that he will, but he hasn't actually gone through the process of being tested by his peers on the field, like scientific papers are tested by other scientists in the field. So, it's sort of a clumsy metaphor, but I think you get the point, right? And maybe I'll go into that a little bit more deeply next week. There's a pretty amusing interview of the person who runs an outfit called Retraction Watch. And they have a list of COVID-19 papers that have already been retracted. And, it's a concern. And, okay, so anyways, I'm not entirely sure that there's enough evidence to suspect that there's a specific neurological component to COVID-19 beyond just the severity of the immune system, reaction to the virus, right? But it seems like neurological symptoms are pretty consistently being recorded. So there seems to be some connection there. We just don't know what the mechanism is that enables this reaction. So in only some people, right? And even if the virus itself doesn't attack the cells of the nervous system, it's not attacking neurons or attacking glial cells, even if it just compromises the function of systems that were already on the brink, right? That were just under the threshold of starting to generate pathologies, systems that might have started to go awry in another 5 or 10 years were it not for the virus. I think it's very important to know because it'll help to get more and more granular about who exactly is at risk of what when it comes to this virus. Okay. Yeah, there's more I wanted to talk about. Oh, and I had this nifty picture that I knew I was going to forget to use. Anyways, it's something that there seems to be a greater frequency of papers trying to understand whether or not there might be a neurological consequence of COVID-19. It seems like they're coming out at a greater rate. So, hopefully we'll learn more as time goes on, and hopefully we'll have more of these large scale studies that have at least a representative sample of at least a country, right? Perhaps it's a little bit easier for it to be done in a country like the UK than it is in the US, but there's no reason we can't do something like that. And it could very well be the case that somebody's already, or a group is already doing that in the US. So we'll keep our eyes peeled. All right. Why don't we start? Let's see. What? Okay. Let's start the life hack. Oh wait, no, wait, let me do this first because I always forget to do it, and I'm not forgetting to do it this time. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD student, a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And on YouTube, I just talked about a pretty large comparatively, relatively large paper that that came out of the UK that attempts to sort of catalog and understand like what proportion of COVID-19 patients who have severe reactions also exhibit neurological symptoms or neurological pathologies, and what the nature of those neurological brain-related pathologies might be. So you can check that out. Search for like Ian Anthropoid on YouTube. Hey Asha, good to see you. Oh, right. I like prepped this and I still forgot to do it. You believe neuroplasticity is real? Well, we don't have to worry about what I believe, right? Fortunately, because there's years and years of evidence that does a pretty good job describing what neuroplasticity even is and at what levels, dimensions of the brain, cells, within neurons, between circuits of neurons. At what domain of the brain neuroplasticity is active, and it's active at all of those. So neuroplasticity encompasses a lot of things that happens in the brain. It's not just like one thing, right? Neuroplasticity includes like changing the number of neurotransmitter receptors that are at a synapse, right? A point of communication between neurons. Like for example, let's say you have a neuron that's releasing dopamine from this neuron, and this neuron is receiving dopamine, right? If this neuron has more receptors for dopamine, for the neurotransmitter dopamine, that signal will change, right? The volume, the volume of how loud that dopamine signal will change. And so changing the number of receptors is one mechanism by which it can happen. Also, changing how sensitive those receptors are to dopamine, right? It just like how significant of a response in the receptor, in the dopamine receptor, it happens, or how significant the response is over time can change. And so this can happen when people use addictive drugs like cocaine or amphetamine. This also happens sort of unfortunately, torturously, with the opioid signaling system. So when somebody uses like OxyContin, oxycodone, or hydrocodone, or fentanyl, or whatever, neuroplasticity is basically the mechanism by which people develop a chemical dependence, but then also an addiction. Not always, in fact, most people don't, but it's how those who do, neuroplasticity is the reason that they do. And by the way, the process of withdrawal from those addictive drugs after chronic use, that process is also a manifestation of neuroplasticity, because the withdrawal is only lasts for a couple days, and the reason that it begins to attenuate is neuroplasticity is kicking in. The brain is essentially getting used to the absence of this molecule that used to be there like all the time, right? Oxycodone. Neuroplasticity is also the reason for healthy brain growth. Indeed. I mean, that's for sure. It's also, the mechanism by which we learn new things, right? If your brain could not change its connectivity between neurons, you wouldn't really be able to learn very much, right? Okay, long-term study on Adderall, 47-year-old on it for 15 years. There have been, Adderall hasn't been around for that long, but there are a lot of interesting sort of longer-term studies that profile like what changes in the brain occur when somebody has been taking Adderall for a long time and at different ages. So it's sort of given rise to a bunch of interesting theories on the utility of, or like why we should or shouldn't use Adderall. And so like one of the theories, for example, that is sort of surprising, but actually it ties into neuroplasticity, is that, the whole theory of ADHD is that there's some architectural difference in the brain of a certain cohort of people that make their ability to focus on a topic or seek a novelty different than other people, right? And we think that the sort of epicenter of that difference, the main point of that difference, is a specific circuit in the brain called the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit. So don't even worry about that. It's basically just a very old, ancient circuit in the brain that is part of the way that you decide, how long to spend working on any one thing. And it just so happens that ADHD medications, Adderall or amphetamine, Ritalin or methylphenidate, the main target of their pharmacological activity, of what they do in the brain, is at that specific circuit. And so one of the theories, for one of the consequences of long-term use of these medications is that actually, rather than, and we're talking about like prescribed, dosages, right? We're not talking about people who are using it for recreational value, which a lot of people do. But, we're talking about like a physician prescribed a certain dose, and that's the dose that you follow. One of the theories is that over time, the brain, via neuroplastic mechanisms, begins to change in such a way as to render their, severity of ADHD symptoms to be lower. That's one theory. Sort of similarly to the way that it is thought that SSRIs or antidepressants actually treat depression when it's successful in treating depression. So that's one theory. It's important to recognize that the reactions that people have, the effects of amphetamine or Adderall or Ritalin in the brain of somebody who doesn't have ADHD is going to be pretty different from the reaction of somebody who does, right? Let's see. Was there anything else? Yeah, so those studies have been done. The cost benefits have been evaluated several times over the years, and the costs of any deleterious long-term consequences have been deemed to be lower than the benefits of being able to function, more effectively in society. So, hey, du beaucoup. Oh, hey, what's up, Elizabeth? Good to see you. Thank you for the super hearts, as always. Actually, it's funny that you bring up ADHD. So it turns out that I think it was last week, the FDA approved a video game for the treatment of ADHD. Yeah, pretty crazy. I mean, these ideas have come up in the past, but the fact that they were able to get the FDA to approve, essentially, doctor prescribed video games for ADHD. Now, that doesn't mean that doctors are actually going to do it. So now the company has like a long road to hoe right now, because they're going to have to be convincing, physicians and physicians to prescribe this video game, but then also insurance companies to cover it, right? But very interesting that it was approved. Okay. Oh, what's the video game? I don't know the name of the video game. I wish that I did, but I don't know what of course I forgot the name of the company. But I'm sure that if you just type into Google or Bing, if you just type in like ADHD video game, FDA, I'm sure it'll come up. Hey, are you not supposed to be scoping the subject brain cryology in so many years? I'm not sure what you mean by that. But nobody's told me to stop. So, all right. What's your operating cosmology? I'll have to think about that a little bit more. I've never really had a word for what that is. The deep question. All right. Hey, hi. You are a brain scientist. Can you tell me about stroke effects on the brain, please? Of course, 7 Prosperous 7. It would be my pleasure. It's a great question. In fact, I just talked about stroke on my YouTube channel, stroke in its relationship with COVID-19. There's a big study that came out of the UK that describes just how frequent neurological symptoms are, just in general, but then also what the most frequent neurological symptoms among these patients who have COVID-19, what the most frequent symptoms are. So you can check that out, type in like Ian Antipoid or something like that. But anyway, so a stroke is basically a deprivation of blood delivery to a certain part of the brain. And depending on how big and the location of that region, you can have different manifestations of stroke. That's why not everybody who has a stroke exhibits the exact same thing. Like some people lose the ability to move, one side of their body or certain parts of their body, but their cognition is totally fine. Like they're totally sharp, they can still speak normally, their memory is fine, you can engage with them, and were it not for just their inability to move their arm or something, you wouldn't think that they even had a stroke. But you can also have strokes where people can move just fine, but they're no longer capable of speaking. Or, obviously it gets more and more severe. So that is all determined by where in the brain this deprivation of blood delivery occurs. And essentially, there's essentially 2 different kinds of stroke, right? There's a hemorrhagic stroke, which is basically a blood vessel in the brain has ruptured and your brain is bleeding, right? So blood is not getting to where it needs to go. And also blood is pooling up where it's not supposed to be. Or you can have an ischemic stroke, which is basically where a blood vessel becomes blocked by something, a blood clot, some plaque that had built up in the circulatory system that gets, jarred loose for whatever reason, and then it navigates until it reaches a blood vessel that's too small for it to continue moving, and then it blocks up that blood vessel. So yeah. Now, I could go on and on about this topic a little bit more if you'd like. Just let me know. Hello. I don't know if we're still going by Bluebird anymore. Enlighten up, but it's good to see you. I hope you're safe and sane. Feels like we're all playing Frogger these days. The friend's mother passed away a couple of years ago, and he told me video games helped him a lot to handle. Yeah, growing up. So I'm in my 30s now, my early 30s. Thank you so much for the super heart. I really appreciate it. BCM nurse. Wait a second. Is it BCM? Oh no, BC Merce. Okay, gotcha. I thought maybe you were from Baylor College of Medicine, which is where I started in graduate school. Yeah, so when I was growing up, video games were basically just like universally considered to be like bad for kids, and far be it from me to like defend a multi-billion-dollar industry. They don't need me to do that. But there's definitely over the years, like right when I was starting graduate school, there was back when they just like completed building Stonehenge, the institution of which I was working, Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, the VA, so BCM, Baylor College of Medicine, is a part of this gigantic medical system called the Texas Medical Center, the biggest medical center in the world, or at least it was at the time. I imagine it probably still is because it's gargantuan, and it didn't stop growing. So the VA hospital, physicians and scientists over there had a project where they were working with returning veterans with PTSD using like virtual reality and essentially like game, like simulations, very video game like, to essentially help to re-expose them to the causative environments of their PTSD. And so that was just like one example. There's another example. There's a group. I can't remember if it's Jack Gallant. I think it is, but a group in California who developed a video game that purported to effectively reduce your reaction time. So in order to make you faster at reacting to like stuff that happens around you. It's a cool project. But I don't think I always forget if it was like a racing game or something like that. But I don't think it ever hit the shelves. But yeah, interesting stuff. Brian is an ICU RN in Florida that has COVID-19 patients, and he scopes on COVID. Wow, that's fabulous. Okay. So not Baylor College or Baylor University. They used to be affiliated, but now Baylor College of Medicine is separate. Although they do have one representative, evidently, on the board from Baylor University that's like mandated from when they separated, which is kind of like funny. Yeah, anyways. How to reset brain. How to upgrade my memory to super fast solid state drive. Yeah, I know, right? I remember when I did that. When I got an SSD, a solid state drive for my computer, I was like, whoa, this is so different. So much faster. Unfortunately, there's no like simple way to do that, right? Because, we you have to really define what precisely you mean by upgrade your software, upgrade your cognition or your speed of cognition. There are definitely some so let's narrow this down a little bit so we can have a conversation. Let's say we're talking just about intelligence, right? However you might define it. Intelligence is notoriously difficult to define. It's become even more complicated to define over the years as we've learned more and more about the brain and relationships to genetics and the environment and so on. But there are definitely some intelligence researchers who would, and they're not necessarily neuroscientists, who would try and make the argument that you can't. That let's say your hardware is your hardware. It can change on the margins, but as measured by, for example, your IQ score or something like that, that's really difficult to change. Now, that's not a consensus opinion necessarily within the neurosciences, but that argument has definitely been made. And there's, it's not like a totally, specious argument or anything like that. There's evidence for it. It is hard to change IQ scores. But anyways, so the best thing you can do is work with the hardware that you have, right? At least until, we have a company like Neuralink or something like that, where we will literally be able to sort of plug and play devices. Neuralink is Elon Musk's company that's working on developing a whole brain computer interface. I talked about that on my podcast, Wired to be Weird, on podcast places. But and Neuralink is not the only company that is doing that. So until we have that, you're stuck with the hardware you got. So the best thing you can do is optimize that hardware, and the best way to do that is to force your brain to solve new problems, learn new information, learn new skills, learn how to dance, learn a martial art, learn how to play a musical instrument or speak a new language. Like, all of those things are pretty substantial challenges that the brain has to navigate. And not only do you get something at the end of that, right? You can dance the salsa, right? But or you can make salsa. But the process itself is generalizable, right? It has benefits that extend beyond just that skill. So, learn new things, expose yourself to new information, to new arguments from people. I think this is one that a lot of people sort of neglect, which is exposing yourself to the arguments of people with whom you reflexively disagree, right? Politics is like an obvious sort of venue for that, but it's not the only, it's not the only one. Like, theology, philosophy, that kind of thing. That's beneficial. That's probably like the most straightforward way to optimize your brain on its own terms without lesioning a structure or taking, drugs that can acutely improve cognition or enhance cognition, but it's acutely, and there's a price to be paid at the end of that, without exception. Okay. The brain is more like software. Well, sort of. It's hardware and software, right? It's one and the same, form following function. It's, for a long time, the way philosophy of mind, which is a sort of branch of philosophy that's focused entirely on the mind, unsurprisingly, had the dual, mind-body sort of model for understanding the relationship between consciousness, or the mind, and the brain and the body. That was sort of like the prevailing model that, owned the landscape for many, many years. But at this point, given contemporary neuroscience and modern technology that we use to ask, more and more granular questions, that is no longer the dominant model. It is, the mind is what the brain makes. It's what the brain produces. And consciousness is what the brain creates. So it's a bit of both. I mean, software is not a bad heuristic, or it's not a bad metaphor, because it's dynamic. You can change it, and it has a similar relationship with hardware, obviously. But they're really more one and the same. It's like if you got a computer, and the computer had a operating system already installed. You could never change it, and you couldn't change any of the components of the computer. But the software on the computer is dynamic and changing, and the computer itself, on its own accord, changes. Right? So it's like a very, very loose metaphor, I suppose. But yeah, it's like if a computer could acquire for itself, you know what? I'm going to position my webcam this way. Actually, that's not a great. I'm going to position the proximity. No, that doesn't even work. but yeah, it's the relationship between consciousness and the brain is a much closer relationship than software and computers. All right. Oh, thank you very much, Enlighten Up. I appreciate that advocacy. I really appreciate it. Wait, what did I say I'm going through? I have memory issues. All right. It's interesting that angiotensin converting enzyme 2 is targeted by COVID. Yeah, so riboflavin, which is somebody who clearly has at least an appreciation for biology, with given that choice of handle. Yeah, so riboflavin, our friend here, is referring to a protein called ACE2, or angiotensin converting enzyme 2, and you're right. It is interesting that SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that generates COVID-19, that causes it, interacts with ACE2. It also interacts with another a protease, another enzyme called TMPRSS2, transmembrane protease 2. And those two things seem to be necessary for the virus to gain entry to, principally your respiratory cells, although there's evidence that it can interact with other proteins beyond just those two, which may explain why it generates such wildly, variable symptoms in a lot of people. So for example, on YouTube, once again, I just talked about a big study, the biggest yet, that came out of the UK, profiling the neurological symptoms that emerge in people who develop rather severe COVID-19. And they sort of took inventory of like what the most frequent neurological symptoms and neuropsychiatric symptoms were. And by the way, a lot of those symptoms, again, these are exclusively in people who have been diagnosed with like rather severe COVID-19. People that develop neuropsychiatric symptoms, about half of them were under the age of 60. So not necessarily in that like risk group that we sort of have been focused on. So worth keeping in mind. So like furin is one protein with which SARS-CoV-2 may be able to interact, and if that's the case, this is a protein that's far more ubiquitous throughout the body than just the respiratory system, and so that might be why there's like organ failure in some people and like clotting disorders in some people. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I might as well bring it up. So there was a study that came out, I think, 4 days ago out of China, out of Hong Kong, I think, actually, where they were evaluating whether or not, or they noticed that patients who ended up being prescribed a statin drug, and I believe it was specifically Lipitor, atorvastatin, I think is the non-trade name for it, they did better. They recovered more effectively than people who were not. And then they also evaluated people who were prescribed ACE2 inhibitors, which would be a little bit more of like an intuitive tool, because once again, ACE2 is one of the things with which SARS-CoV-2 needs to interact to gain entry. At least we're pretty sure. By the way, this was also ACE2 was one of the mechanisms that justified a lot of people early on saying smokers seem to be particularly vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2. You haven't heard that very much recently, and there have been some studies that suggest otherwise, in fact, but one of the mechanisms that was speculated to explain why that might be the case, and that whole concept came out mostly of China, because a lot of people in China smoke, principally males smoke, and it turned out that smokers tended to respond more poorly to COVID-19. And one of the mechanisms that was speculated to explain this was there's some evidence that, and not all the evidence is corroborative, but there's some evidence that smoking elevates levels of ACE2 in the lungs. So that would just, give, theoretically, that would give the virus more opportunities to attack, right, to gain entry. It's like more of the gates are open, right, to the castle, so the barbarians can storm the castle. I am dumb. Is this bad? No, and I doubt that you're dumb. Okay. Hey, my friend's son has mental illness. Can this be treated with supplements and nutrition? So Ty 1134. So I mean, as a scientist, like, you never want to put yourself in a position. Rarely do you ever put yourself in a position to say categorically yes or categorically no. That's why oftentimes conversations with scientists can be a little bit more frustrating than physicians. Physicians are trained to, be a lot more categorical about their diagnoses and their explanations for your diseases or disorders. But for this topic, mental illnesses, I mean, that's a very wide variety. I don't know what kind of mental illness you're talking about. It could be like depression, it could be schizophrenia, right? Mental illness, it is a very severe, it's a category of very severe maladies, right, that I think oftentimes are underestimated and maybe like trivialized a little bit just because you can't see them. And there's no like very like overt, change in somebody's body visibly, but it's a very significant concern. I mean, suicide rates in the United States have been rising for years now, and I believe they're still rising. Drug overdose has been at, absolutely catastrophic levels for years. Like in 2017, I think there were like, several thousand more than 70,000 drug overdose fatalities, and something like 40,000, maybe it was, something like just under 40,000 were induced, just under 30,000 were induced by fentanyl alone. Now, that number seems to be plateauing, and, I think 2018, it went down to like, 69,000, right? And but then it ticked up the next year, and so it's sort of like plateauing a little bit, but that is a gigantic number. I mean, just to give you a concept of like how high that is of just drug overdose. Once again, like the majority of this is driven by opioids, and by the way, the majority are non-prescribed opioids, right? So just to be totally clear about that. That is higher than like the peak number of people who were dying in car accidents before seatbelts were mandated, right? There's been a bunch of other things like I think the peak number of people who were dying from AIDS was lower than this number of people who are dying from drug overdose fatalities. So this is a crisis. This is like a real crisis, and I'm sort of baffled by the lack of any like really substantive response. And it's not this isn't one something that you can blame all on one administration, one federal administration. It's just sort of baffling. I mean, I suppose I can understand why they might not be prioritizing it, but it's a wild number of people, So that oftentimes, very frequently, conditions like depression, anxiety associated conditions, people with those conditions will be sort of predisposed to self-medicating with the very drugs that are driving the drug overdose fatality epidemic. So all of this to say, if somebody has a mental illness, trying to solve it on your own, particularly if you don't have any any training, or trying to solve it without any clinical input, that's a very risky prospect. So I sort of understand. Well, I can empathize with people who just want to avoid having to engage the medical system, particularly if they can't afford it, right? That's like a whole other horrible component of this. But like or people who just like don't want to have to deal with medications and that kind of thing. They want to like keep it natural, those types of concerns, with which I disagree, by the way. Like trying to cure something naturally is not intrinsically better or healthier. But given the severity of this, it really does warrant bringing him to a physician. You did say son, right? Yeah. Supplements and nutrition can certainly help. Like, and that's why I didn't want to say like, it doesn't help, or that's silly. Nutrition is far more important for brain health than I think we sort of popularly appreciate. Supplements, I'm a bit more skeptical of, but paying attention to nutrition, that'll be something that a physician will bring up for sure, or if they should. Okay, it looks like we are connected. What's your name and where are you calling from? Did you say cocaine cookie? I don't think that's a good way to consume cocaine, dude. All right. Oh man, I'm way behind. Okay, is it raining where you are? No. Does it look like it's raining? No. It's extraordinarily hot though. Okay, what's the psychology behind consumers? Nonchalant, NYC. That's a very interesting topic. I mean, for questions like this, I can only help but, the best I can do is speculate. And speculate from the perspective, not of a psychologist, but from the perspective of a scientist who studied things like addiction, anxiety, the regulation of behavior by mood, essentially. I think that, and, there have been some really interesting evaluations of like the sort of origins of like advertising and the manipulation of consumers into being driven to obtain certain products. So like one of the most surprising, perhaps, little tidbits is that the sort of the person, the grandfather of he called it public relations at the time, but it's basically advertising, is a guy named I think it was Edward Bernays. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And guess who his uncle was? Sigmund Freud. Pretty wild. Anyways, like that guy came up with some of the earliest advertisements that made cigarettes a bit more appealing to female consumers, because at the time women just didn't really smoke nearly as frequently. And he had like a really, I sort of vaguely recall the ad, which was like the Statue of Liberty, where the torch that she's holding, holding up, is replaced with a cigarette, and the whole concept is like this is your freedom, right? Like you control your own decisions, right? So and so smoking a cigarette is sort of like embracing your freedom or your power. And who knows just how effective that was, but he did a bunch of other really interesting stuff. I think he was covered in a Adam Curtis documentary called The Century of Self. Pretty sure that's what it was. Anyways, I fundamentally, and there are domains within neuroscience that do focus on neuroeconomics. It's sort of like a nascent field, but Paul Zak, I think is his name, is one guy who is one neuroeconomist who was active at where I went to college, and he did some of the sort of earlier oxytocin studies, where if you administer oxytocin, which is a hormone that's produced in the brain, if you administer oxytocin to somebody and you test them for their for their predisposition to trusting somebody else, it turns out that you will increase the likelihood that they will engage in a trustful or they will trust this person. They'll engage with this person and trust them. And economists have had these sort of like tools that evaluate decision making in economic situations. Like I forgot what it's called, but basically it's like you give one of the people, there's two people, you give one of them like $2, and if you give a certain amount to the other person, that number increases. 2 becomes 4, and if they give you money back, that number goes up and up and up, right? But at a certain point, only one of them can win, right? And so at a certain point, somebody's gonna be like, you know what, I'm cool with $10. I don't think this guy's gonna give me $12, so I'm cutting you off right here. And it turned out that when people were administered oxytocin, that threshold would be higher. Like they would go for longer. And oxytocin has a bunch of very interesting properties with regards to like pair bonding and love and parental attachment, stuff like that. A mother's attachment to her child is very significantly regulated by oxytocin. But anyways, so I think that the goal of all of these enterprises, the goal of Edward Bernays, or the goal of any of these marketing companies, is to tap into extraordinarily primitive components of your consciousness, right? Your concern, your love for your family, or your desire to exhibit socioeconomic power, socioeconomic achievement. So I think that is fundamentally what drives consumerism, or drives that component of consumerism. But consumerism more broadly, I mean, that's very, very complicated, I would imagine. I would imagine consumerism is different in different economic systems. Okay, is weed bad for our brains long term? Vada Ashley. So it's a complicated question, complicated topic, but not that complicated. So, for example, if you were asking, is alcohol bad for your brain long term? The answer is yes. And in fact, for a long time for alcohol, there was this opinion, this sort of received wisdom that you can break up alcohol consumption patterns into different categories. There's like mild, moderate, and heavy, right? And mild, what counts as mild consumption varies between countries. Like some countries, people just tend to drink more, like the United States or South Korea in particular has their what is considered mild is much higher than a bunch of other countries. Australia also I think is pretty high. And the UK used to be quite high, but they've actually reduced it. But anyways, there was received wisdom that mild and probably moderate consumption patterns are probably benign for the brain, and there are even some studies that tried to demonstrate that actually there's some benefits. But everybody was sort of on the same page that heavy consumption of alcohol, and things like binge drinking, is bad for the brain, bad for health, no matter what. Fairly recent, at this point, a study came out of the UK that basically demonstrated, is the biggest study of its kind, demonstrated that even mild consumption of alcohol is bad for the brain, or it's bad for the body. So if you asked about alcohol, I'd say yes. But cannabis is different. Cannabis itself doesn't damage neurons. It's not neurotoxic, or cannabinoids in cannabis. There's no evidence that they damage neurons, right? So that would be like number one. If a drug damages neurons, if it can kill neurons over the long term, it's going to be bad for you. So there's that. But hey, opioids, they're not neurotoxic unless you overdose and stop breathing, obviously. But the opioids themselves, oxycodone, fentanyl, they don't kill neurons. So, and I think everybody would be on the same page that like it's a pretty non-trivial life decision if you're deciding to take, a lot of opioids regularly, right? But cannabis isn't the same. It doesn't have the same severity of addictive properties. Cannabis can be addictive, for sure. But the withdrawal from cannabis isn't life-threatening like it is for alcohol or benzodiazepines. It's not as severe as it is for like opioids and nicotine even. So there's that, right? The only reason I'm not saying like for sure it's fine for you, which a lot of people I think are out there that would say that it is, or that it's even good for you, is that there have been studies that do show that there are sort of long-term changes in the anatomy of the brain, the sort of gross level anatomy, meaning like the big stuff, like stuff you can see with your eyes. And that is driven inevitably by molecular long-term changes. And specifically what we're talking about is changes in ratios of white matter to gray matter. Gray matter is like the neurons themselves. White matter is the connections between them, essentially. They're the axons. They're wrapped in this fatty insulation, sort of like your phone charging cord, the plastic on that cord. Particularly if you have an iPhone charging cord, because it's white. It's the fat along axons is white. All right. However, like if that were the whole story, then I would say, yeah, I mean it's not good necessarily, but it's certainly not as bad as most other drugs that are legal to consume. However, there's not any evidence that those changes are permanent, and so it could just be the case that let's say you smoked for 10 years, but then you quit and you don't smoke for 10 more years. It could very well be the case that you sort of return to homeostasis. So that's sort of the spiel. All right, it sounds like we are connected. What's your name and where are you calling from? You there? Oh, that's too bad. He had is it Charlie Sheen? Is that his name? I wear my shirt just like you. Well, thank you. You have good taste. What can I say? Okay. Line up. Okay, I have quit tobacco too. We smoke too much in Europe and Asia. Yeah, so I went to China 2 years ago now. Gosh, it's wild how many people smoke there. And when I went to Italy many years ago, and it was also like pretty wild to see how many people smoke in Italy. And I think smoking is pretty common in the UK. What's interesting about the difference between how the UK and the United States have addressed e-cigs, like vaping, nicotine specifically. The UK government actually recommended that people use e-cigs to help wean themselves off of cigarettes. Whereas, obviously, we've had a far more fraught relationship with e-cigs in the United States. It's kind of an interesting difference. For the record, I think that is correct. Like, I think, e-cigs, but, assuming that they're produced with high quality control and they don't have anything toxic in their liquids, they are likely a very good tool or useful tool to quit smoking cigarettes. And cigarettes are almost certainly to be going to be shown to be worse for your lungs, worse for your body. U.S. hates the e-cigs. Yeah. What's interesting? So gosh, I can't remember where I gave this presentation, but obviously one of the biggest, probably the biggest by far e-cig company is Juul, which is like Juul. They make like basically an e-cig that looks like a USB thumb drive, sort of. They were going to be acquired by a company by I think Philip Morris, which is like one of the old gigantic tobacco companies, and basically and then I think it was Philip Morris or it was Altria or one of the big tobacco companies, who cares, and they stepped back from that deal because, at least in part, at least this is like the inferred reason, because of all the government scrutiny that Juul was getting, Juul specifically, and for good reason. Like Juul is almost single-handedly responsible for this giant spike in the number of adolescents who are using e-cigs, and so and like there's some really great journalism where, of course, Juul would say like, that is not our goal. We would never. How dare you? I never. But there's some good journalism that showed. Actually, they probably did know. And it probably represented a pretty substantial share of their revenues. But but what later happened was that tobacco company came out with a thing called, of course, I'm forgetting. It's such a weird name. It's like, God, it's irritating. Anyways, basically what it is, it's like a little device that you stick a cigarette into, essentially a cigarette, and it operates like a vaporizer for cannabis. It basically like heats up the tobacco, and so it's still vapor, but you're working with cigarettes, and this it's called like heat not burn. And so it could have just been the case that they were like, hey, you know what? We have all this tobacco, and no, not a dab pen. There's like a name for it. It's like Etox or something like that. It's like it's a weird name, which is why I can't remember it. So it might have just been the case like hey, Juul is going to be totally hamstrung by the government, and we're going to put out this device, and we have a pretty good relationship with the U.S. federal government. It turns out, right? And also, I think the new CEO of Juul, relatively new CEO of Juul, was an executive at one of those big tobacco companies, which is kind of interesting. I'm tired of COVID. I don't know whether to go out or turn my living room into a garden. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, what's happening now in the United States is something that a lot of people were concerned would happen, which is, yes, IQOS. Thank you so much. Yes, that's the heat not burn device. There's another one too that I think is made by a competitor company. And it's basically just vaporizing tobacco, whereas e-cigs, they basically dope some like vegetable glycerin or polyethylene glycol with nicotine, and there might be some pretty meaningful differences. I should note, like for this IQOS heat not burn vaporizer kind of thing, it might very well be the case that would be a better tool for people who are like really struggling to quit smoking than e-cigs, because it turns out, and this is unsurprising to anybody who's studied tobacco or nicotine, as I have, but there are a bunch of molecules that are psychoactive molecules that are present in tobacco that beyond just nicotine. It's unfortunate that the vast majority of research, it's understandable, it's justifiable, but it's unfortunate that the vast majority of research is focused on nicotine specifically rather than like a full tobacco extract, because there are like MAOIs in tobacco, right, that inhibit the metabolism or the breakdown of monoamine neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, right? And so and there's a bunch of other stuff in tobacco that obviously that's not in e-cigs. And when people try to transition from a cigarette, or analog as the kids call it, an actual cigarette to an e-cig, they still have withdrawal symptoms. They're not as severe as if they didn't have any nicotine, but they have withdrawal. And I've read about this in the literature, and I've had friends who've done it personally tell me this. So theoretically, this IQOS platform might be able to deliver a little bit more of like a full spectrum of all of the psychoactive components of cigarettes, of tobacco, rather than just nicotine. Okay. So where are we going with COVID-19? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. Like, I am almost certain that I had conversations about this, months ago, back when, the New York City was having a spike, New Jersey was also having a spike, and I'm from Brazil. I'm from the United States, and Philadelphia actually did pretty well, actually, kind of surprisingly. But of course, New York City was going to be hit first with the greatest severity of COVID-19, right? But there was like And I talked about this concern where it's like, it's not a matter of whether or not it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen in the rest of the country, where there's just fewer people, lower densities of people, fewer commuters or people who travel through in and out of the city. And now, unfortunately, it's the wave has reached the shores of those other states. And so, yeah, like, we're still in this for sure. Like, this is there. I get the feeling, or I get the feeling that people are sort of perceiving COVID-19 as sort of starting to be over because, the numbers are looking a bit better now in New York City. And New York City, of course, is where a lot of media comes from, particularly news media. But it's got to be taken seriously. Like this, it's not like the virus cares. It's not like the virus has changed. But listen, I 100% empathize with your fatigue about this. Like, I have a daughter. She's a bit over a year and a half old right now, and she would definitely be playing with making friends, developing social interactions, social skills with other babies, if this didn't happen. And that's her knocking on the door. It's very cute. She knows how to knock like an adult. And she's like, doo, doo, doo. It's very funny. Anyways. And so, I feel terrible about that because, who knows what the effects of this pandemic are going to be on not only her development, neuronal development, her development in general, but also her generation, right? I wouldn't be surprised if they called this Generation C, right, for COVID. The flip side is that she has, substantially more one-on-one time with both of her parents at all times when she's conscious, right? And she's learning a lot very quickly. She already knows well above 100 words, which is a lot for her age. And that's because, we don't just sit around, we read together, she learns, she can now read the word slow and she can read the word exit because those signs are all over. I have a garage that we walk through that has a wide open roof deck where we can, we're alone essentially, so we're not at risk. And so she can recognize the letter S and the letter L and O and W and X. And so I doubt that she would have developed those skills so rapidly were it not for all of this time with her parents. But there's a cost to this for sure. So listen, and beyond that, of course, hey, I would certainly love to not have to stay within my apartment. So my daughter also loves the garden. So I don't know if you can tell, I have plants behind me. She always looks forward to that. And so I'm sure she's getting a little impatient. But we have a bit more time together. So yeah, I get the fatigue, but the ethical calculations have not changed. The ethical calculations are, there's a proportion of people who are vulnerable to fatalities from this disease, but also from, to just rather severe consequences of infection. And they tend to be a bit older, but not exclusively, for sure not exclusively. And once again, I brought this up on YouTube, and you can find the YouTube by, searching for Ian Anthropoid or something like that. That this study out of the UK, pretty big study, biggest study of its kind yet, found that among people who developed severe reactions to COVID-19, about half of those who developed neuropsychiatric conditions, mood-related, psychiatric conditions, behavioral changes, things like that, were under the age of 60. So, this thing hasn't changed. And, I think rather than directing any frustration that you might have at, your own behavior or how, at the virus, frankly, I think that the people who are responsible, whose jobs it is to confront these challenges and manage the situation, they didn't do a good job. They just didn't. Basically from the beginning, and they're still not. That's what I recommend. You scrutinize. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe it's this was bound to happen in a country like America, where we value personal, liberty a lot, or at least we say we do a lot. So that's just different than other cultures. And maybe this is just one of the potential vulnerabilities of all the benefits that we get from those principles. But I personally do not think that that's true. I think that there's no reason that we should be dealing with over 125,000 fatalities, and just the numbers are mind-boggling. So, okay. Obviously, I don't know. Can you tell that that I'm also a little bit frustrated? How are your succulents doing? Oh, thank you for asking, Elizabeth. They're doing fabulously. In fact, they're doing much better. Actually, I'm also growing some basil. I don't know if you can. Yeah, shoot. I can't show you. Take my word for it. Wait, what am I doing here? Here we go. So, and the reason is that we have a lot more direct sun for like basically half the day. And I don't know if you can really see it. I'm going to try not to drop it like an idiot. I don't know if you can see this one. It's called a Black Prince, I believe. I had to decapitate it because it developed some rot. And not only has it like given rise to like 3 new heads, but it's changing colors like that. It's changing colors really quickly. It's beautiful. Yeah. Okay. That was a pretty big detour from at least biomedical science. If she's your daughter, she will be just fine. I'm sure you're helping her with her developmental skills. Yeah, I mean, well, of course we're doing our best, right? As every parent is. But, there's just an inevitable cost to this. It's unfortunate. But it's necessary. All right. Something positive to do in COVID times. Google, you just trim the white part off and drop them in water in a cup. I love Brazilians. You'll never buy green onions again. Oh, cool. It's so easy. Look it up. Yeah. People are not socially distancing or wearing masks to prevent the spread. COVID won't end soon. Yeah, I mean, I think that's unfortunately true in parts of the country, and the consequences are evident, right? So, I from the beginning, when this started happening and I started talking about it on, these live streams, I took it very seriously. Our family started like social distancing earlier than was sort of recommended by the government. And so, I would recommend that you all take it rather seriously. All right, let's see. Yeah. But I don't blame it. I bought a cactus and it died after a week of me giving it chocolate milk to drink in the mornings. What, it doesn't like chocolate milk? Do you know the correlation between being immunocompromised and not displaying a typical fever? No, I have not heard that. Although if the reason you're immunocompromised is that you're taking immunosuppressant drugs, that might inhibit your immunological reaction to the virus, which may reduce the severity of your fever. What city is this? It is Philadelphia, my beloved Philadelphia. What would you do if you were in charge? well, I mean, I am not an expert in this, but one of the glaring deficiencies in our response has been how long it's taken for tests to be made available, widely available, that is like the number one issue. Because, as frustrated as we all are, if testing were far easier to obtain, then we could talk more seriously about like, okay, we can really focus on sort of regional hotspots rather than like entire states. There was that, and the federal government can mandate that companies that are positioned to create tests make them. Or, enlists, institutions like the University of Pennsylvania, the Perelman School of Medicine, where I worked. We do PCR every single day. And, I would imagine that just with it's a logistics nightmare, of course. But, the resources have been here since before the pandemic. And so, had we kicked into gear earlier, we would be in a very different position right now. And far fewer people would have died. Also, the first, messaging about masks was just wrong. And, I had conversations with my parents about this. Here. Okay, we can talk about that in a sec. Yeah, let's see. Looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Hello?
Yeah. What's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm Jay. I'm from Florida. I want to ask a question.
Okay.
Basically, how do you differentiate between laziness and like being like kind of low IQ, like incapable of doing the thing, you know?
Yeah. No, that's a totally fine question. So, I mean, they're related. Oh, yeah. Thanks for calling, man. They're obviously related, right? Motivation is a very critical component of performance on basically anything. But that includes cognitive, intellectual performance. But how you have to really like define precisely what you mean by laziness, right? Like laziness for me is a term that criticizes somebody for not taking actions that they could have easily done to improve their situation, right? Be it like, rather than, let's take like school as a model, because most of us at least have gone to like, junior high and high school. Like rather than studying for a test, you decided to stay home or play video games or go to parties. And that's a decision, right? It's a decision to put off, to neglect the hard thing, the doing the studying, and the thing that's not as rewarding for the one that's more intrinsically and immediately rewarding. So that that's a version of laziness, but it doesn't mean necessarily that like somebody's just like laying in bed all day, right? So there's that, and that I think is the most meaningful discussion at this level, just distinguishing laziness from being less intelligent. But the nuance that I'm trying to underline here is that like just because people don't perform well in school doesn't mean that they're lazy, right? And the reason that motivation is so important is that like if somebody has never associated positive outcomes, positive, rewards for engaging in certain behaviors, there's really no good reason to think that they ever would, right? So basically, like, the anatomically, what we're talking about when it comes to motivation and laziness, anatomically, one of the main circuits that I think any neuroscientist would bring up is the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit, specifically the mesolimbic dopamine circuit. And that is essentially like a gauge in your brain that will determine just how much of a reward you anticipate to receive after engaging in a behavior. And it is a dopamine signal. And in fact, it is the dopamine signal with which various drugs interact, like amphetamines. All recreational drugs actually interact with it, but most, famously, amphetamine and methylphenidate, Adderall and Ritalin. So the point is that, like, if you don't anticipate that there's a benefit, there's a reward at the end of this activity, studying, performing at a high level at your job, whatever it might be, exercising. If you don't anticipate that there's a positive outcome at the end of that effort, your brain doesn't have the language to motivate you to do it, right? The very thing that is necessary to avoid laziness is at a deficit. And so, so when it comes to education or a lot of the things that I think people associate with intelligence, a person has to be, reared to anticipate positive outcomes from engaging in that kind of activity. Okay. So yeah. Now, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to suggest that there are disparities in like, educational performance or, metrics of intellect, right? Metrics of intelligence. There are disparities. There are a bunch of reasons for that. And some of them, almost certainly not the majority, but some of them will have to do with the cards you were dealt, right? The genes that you inherited. But I would argue, as somebody who studied the relationship between mood and behavior, that it is at most just one character in that story, and probably a lesser determinative factor than your environment, your life experiences, and the resources at your disposal. Okay, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I guess the short way to put it is that while they might seem very closely related, at least from the perspective of a neuroscientist, they're not the same. And oftentimes when you determine them to be, when you determine somebody who either you find to be just kind of dull or not particularly intelligent, when you perceive them to be lazy, or that laziness was the reason for that, I think you're making an error. Okay. All right. If they hate a mass drive ventilator. Ian has a PhD, he already has enough money. I'm not going to spend money I have on super hearts. Bless the fall. Listen, I would never try and coax you to give super hearts. I certainly appreciate it, but you don't get a lot of money for getting a PhD. Like, I am not making any money actually right now. And the job that I'm, knock on wood, in less than a month that I will be starting, I'm not going to be making very much money. I'm going to be making less money than if I just stayed in academia. So no worries. Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I appreciate the super hearts a lot, and all of the revenue that comes from any of this or Patreon. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/anthropoid, and whatever it might be, only goes to equipment for live streaming. That's it. So yeah, I really appreciate it. But listen, I know the times are tough for everybody, so I totally get if people hesitate to do that. And some people are extraordinarily generous, and I am indebted to them. I feel like it's my duty to reciprocate in trying to chat with folks who aren't necessarily in a situation where they get to interact with scientists very much. I never met a scientist until I was in college. All right. Let's see. As COVID goes around, I do not show fevers, no suppressants. So Simply Amanda 007, that it's an interesting phenomenon, right? So not only are there disparities in how severely people react to COVID-19, but there also seem to be disparities in just who's actually at risk of becoming infected with SARS-CoV-2, with COVID-19, and how severe the reactions are. There are a couple theories as to why that might be the case. One of the theories that's been sort of lingering for a while, and I talked about this last time, but bears repeating, I suppose, is that back in the first SARS outbreak, right, SARS-CoV-1, right, the first coronavirus that generated like an epidemic, it was noted that there tended to be disparities in blood group antigens. So, if you're type A, type B, type O, whatever it might be, in the statistics of people who showed up to the hospital with SARS. But it was just purely correlational. Turns out that there have been a couple studies now that suggest that also might be the case with SARS-CoV-2. Might be the case. This kind of a study is a very difficult study to conduct responsibly or effectively, because it's very difficult to get a representative. It depends on what question you're asking, right? If you're trying to make the claim that people who are type A are at a much lower risk than people who are type B or type, whatever, AB or O or whatever it is, you have to make sure that you have enough type A blood type people that you're studying. And it's going to take tons of people. So that study really has not been done. But what we do have are these correlations that suggest that it might be the case that if you just happen to have a certain blood group antigen, certain blood type, you're just not as likely to show up at the hospital. Okay, let's put it that way. So there's that, and if SARS-CoV-2 does indeed discriminate based off of blood groups, then or blood types, it wouldn't be the only virus that does that. So the norovirus, which sort of in the kind of the cruise ship virus, right, the virus that causes a horrible nausea and vomiting and diarrhea and just the worst, it does that. It only certain blood types are vulnerable to very severe reactions. So that might explain part of it, right? That said, you even if you're not, if you don't even develop COVID-19, right, you can still spread the virus. It just so happens that you're not as vulnerable as other people. So, I get that people will have a predisposition to being like, hey, I'm okay, and I'm keeping the people I love okay, and, that's their responsibility to keep themselves okay. I can't dissuade you from that perspective. That's just not how I feel about, my fellow Americans. When somebody's grandmother, grandfather, father, uncle, when they pass away, that's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy that I think will have reverberations in society for much longer than just when we're done in this phase of dealing with this virus. I think 70% of the population will get infected eventually. Yeah, there's some pretty wildly, there's a pretty wide range of, models projecting different percentages. I mean, I think we're certainly beyond the point now in the United States where this thing is just going to go away. And it's really just going to be a matter of whether or not an effective therapeutic comes out. There was the, what was it? It's dexamethasone. There was basically an anti-inflammatory drug, essentially. It's like this old, in a similar category to like hydroxychloroquine, but different mechanism, different drug. Meaning that it's old, it's been used for a long time, it's well understood, it's very cheap to make. And I can't remember where the study was, but it was something like a third. It had very beneficial treatment outcomes. However, that doesn't mean that, it's not a targeted treatment, right? It's really essentially designed, or the goal of using it would be to inhibit that cytokine storm, that immune system overreaction to the virus that is what causes a lot of, the fatalities and the pathologies. So not even that will really change our lot. But if a targeted therapeutic is generated, and there are people who are working on, for example, we were talking about the what is assumed or pretty confidently assumed to be the principal proteins with which SARS-CoV-2 has to interact to gain entry to respiratory cells. Working on like a TMPRSS inhibitor or, an ACE2 inhibitor. ACE2 inhibitors are pretty widely used already. And in fact, there's some evidence that that there might be some benefit to ACE2 inhibitors. A study that just came out of Hong Kong that I talked about on the YouTube, by the way. So it's like, is it just youtube.com/anthropoid? I think it is. But you can just search for like Anthropoid Ian or Ian Brain Neuroscience or something like that. I talked about a couple cool studies today before going live here. Or until we get a vaccine, until we're there, like, I think that the higher ranges of how widespread it's going to be before, we have something like a vaccine they're probably more accurate. Unfortunately, it is tragic. Like it is a generation defining tragedy. It's a century defining tragedy already. Like that's already happened. So now it's just a matter of just how much worse it's going to get. It's just, I think it's awful that it's been politicized. It's deeply unfortunate. Will you start an OnlyFans to make money? I don't really know what that is. I would be interested in it though. Many studies are far from conclusive at this point because of the lack of data due to small sizes. That's totally right. Yeah, so great point. Right. Yeah. So a lot of the studies, and almost all of them are just observational, or basically they're just statistical correlations. That's almost all of them. Not all of them, but almost. And that it's not like those are useless data, but they are like not as confident sources of decision making. So there's that. There's also, I talked about this again on the YouTube in greater depth, but the number of papers that have already had to be retracted about COVID-19 is wild, right? So the virus has only been here for a couple months. It's only existed for a couple months. And something like I think 20 papers have had to be retracted already. That's nuts. Like that is a lot. Sorry. Oh, Elizabeth, I don't know why you're apologizing. Or maybe you're apologizing to somebody else. I totally lost my train of thought. That's the first time that's happened to me in a while. Oh, yeah, right. Duh. The other problem that I'm seeing with... oh, no, please. I'm glad you came at all. It's my pleasure. There's a problem with the way that COVID-19 is being communicated to the public, not by the biomedical community, but by really ambitious journalists. And it's not done out of a cynical, unethical, predisposition. They're just communicating, information as quickly as possible, and obviously trying to get clicks. Obviously, I mean blaming them for doing that is like blaming a fish for being wet, right? Like that's their job. The problem, however, is that I'm seeing a lot of reporting on what are called preprint articles, or basically articles that have yet to go through peer review, meaning that these are sets of experiments that may likely prove to be conducted effectively and competently, but all papers, before they're published, like before they're out and ready to be conveyed to the public by journalists, have to go through peer review. Meaning, let's say you study addiction, or you study anxiety, you publish a paper, or you want to publish a paper. I might be contacted to review it, to go through it and say you know what, they made this mistake here, or maybe they should think about this other experiment, or they're making this claim and that claim doesn't really. It's not really supported by the data. That's a long process. It can take months and months, if not years and years, to go through. I'm going through it right now, by the way, and I'm probably going to deposit my paper on a public, on a preprint repository like bioRxiv. The problem here is that bioRxiv is open, so you can go and search it if you want, and that's what journalists have done, and so they're using these preprint articles to make claims. And say scientists have discovered why it is that SARS-CoV-2 causes anosmia, right? There's this story about anosmia, or olfactory dysfunction, basically the loss of smell and disrupted taste from COVID-19 for a pretty substantial proportion of COVID-19 patients. That came from a preprint article initially. And that's a problem, right? I think that's a very big problem, and I think it's going to have very severe consequences for how the public perceives biomedical science. So I'm very concerned about that moving forward. It probably sounds like a semantic point or something, or it sounds like a petty, we have more important concerns. But the problem is that decisions are being made by people outside of science based off of what they're reading in the news, which is what you should be doing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is that if these stories aren't being vetted by enough scientists yet. Hello, TS. Sorry, okay, I'm not going to say that. How dare you? This is a fine establishment. This room doesn't deal with such filth. Good to see you, Upes. Let's see. Okay, what is your take on COVID-19 blood clots in the lungs leading to stroke? Yeah, so Mr. Eric Vega, love that topic. In fact, I talked about that topic earlier before I went live on Twitter, Periscope, on YouTube. So you can go to youtube.com/anthropod, I think. Let me just test that. I think that works. Yes, it does work. So youtube.com/anthropoid, or you can just search for Ian Anthropoid or something like that. Anyways, because there's a big study that came out of the UK, the biggest of its kind to date. I've already talked about it 4 times in the live stream. So just the short story is that among patients who have severe reactions to COVID-19, there does seem to be a preponderance of neurological reactions. And the most frequent symptom was stroke. Most frequently ischemic stroke, although there were some hemorrhagic strokes. So, yeah. You need moderators. I do have some. Why? It seems like everything's fine. I don't have any problem with that. Hey, Scott, no worries, man. We can always talk. Can you block the children scratch? Block the chicken scratch. What are you talking about? Okay, it sounds political. Answer the phone. Oh, is somebody calling? I don't have my microphone set up for the phone calling, as opposed to the non-phone calling. Okay, yeah, nobody's calling. You trolling? Okay. So, yeah, the trolls have entered the chat and they want to call in. Oh, are they calling in? No, I'm not seeing. Oh, I see. The button is blocked. Okay, got it. Sorry about that, folks. I couldn't see the little icon thing. Huh. Oh, we're trying to connect. We'll see if it works. Huh. Seems like there's something going wrong with the stream. That's unfortunate. Some things you read might not be exactly true. Indeed, yeah. Yeah, and that's always true. That's a misconception about how biomedical science works. Scientists, whenever a scientist is reading or discussing a paper, here, I think we'll have to try that again later. We all understand that, first of all, if it's gone through peer review, we understand. If it hasn't, then we understand the level of stringency or the level of confidence at which we should discuss these findings, right? But then we also appreciate that. I feel like I remember Iconic Irene, and I think you're a troll, right? And we remember that one study does not equate to a consensus, right? It takes multiple studies from multiple groups from all over the world who ask the same or similar questions from different perspectives using different tools to come to the same conclusion to develop a consensus. The problem with how a lot of biomedical science is reported is that one study comes out, it makes very provocative findings, and then it's described as once again, scientists have discovered that if you are blood group, if you're blood type A, then you're going to be fine. That no scientist would ever describe things like that way. Some physicians do, but I don't begrudge them that because they're sort of trained to do that. But that's sort of a disparity in understanding how to manage all of these discoveries. And I'm worried that it's just not being applied enough at the level of journalism, and that's having consequences for people who are just trying to do their best to navigate this. You hate Lee, but not this. Admi, I have a quick question. I'm almost certain that you're a troll. Almost certain. All right. I'm craving a burrito. I'm always craving it. Oh my God. There's so much food that I've been craving. There's also a statistical fluke, and misinterpretation of data as well. Exactly. And that is what we're talking about when it's when scientists are having conversations about any scientific finding, that's already assumed. I assume that another scientist knows that, and we don't. It doesn't have to be said. Yeah. When they ask to add them, they are actually saying to block them. Yeah. Ian trolls Zen Master. Yeah, I just when somebody's so ambitious to get on, I think that's a troll. That's a troll perspective. All right. Answer the phone. Add me. I got brain questions. Well, why don't you go ahead and add one and put it down in the chat right there. Yeah, it's a statistical fluke. She speaks from experience. I'm sorry to hear that, man. Have you seen the most recent exploitation of peer reviewers by the billionaire publishers? Yes. Oh, well, I mean, that's a very long-standing... The scientific publication industry is nuts. Okay, so just to give you like a... When I describe this to somebody, it's like does not make sense. Okay, so I've published several papers, right? And so you can go see those papers. You have to go to, Elsevier or, Addiction or something like that, these journals to go find it. And those publishers, the Nature or Cell or something like that, not that I've ever published in those, but I publish those experiments through that publisher. That publisher then distributes my experiments, my paper, to be peer reviewed by other scientists that are not working at the journal. Like, these are not employees. These are basically volunteers who are very busy already, right? They're professors and they're active researchers. And they do the peer review, and then the peer reviewers send it back, and then an editor who does work at the journal then makes a final decision as to whether or not the journal will actually publish the paper. Okay, so who do you think is getting paid? Oh wait, and then for you to get that article, generally speaking, my PhD is in neuroscience. To get that article, if you're not at like an institution like the University of Pennsylvania or Berkeley or MIT or whatever, you'll have to pay for just one article like $39, like $40 for about 10 pages worth of science and exposition, right? And images, beautiful images, if it's one of my publications. So you have to pay to get it. Now, if you are at an institution like the University of Pennsylvania, the institution has a subscription to the journal. So they pay many thousands of dollars a year to have unlimited access to all of the journals at all the papers published by a journal, right? These are big contracts, like tens of thousands of dollars, okay, yearly. Now, could you guess what the other source of revenue, apart from you paying for articles from your own pocket, or institutions, educational institutions like the University of Pennsylvania paying for subscriptions, can you guess what a third source of revenue is for these publication companies? It's me. I have to pay to get my paper published. So I'm paying, they're taking it on both sides. It's not advertisers, it's not ads. Believe it or not. They're taking money on both sides. They're taking money from people who are consuming the articles, and they're taking money from people who are like writing the articles. Okay? Like they're, and by the way, as much as I, emphasize the importance of peer review, and it is critical, it is deficient. Okay, and there are many opportunities to improve the peer review process. And these publishing companies are multi-billion-dollar companies. I mean, they are gigantic companies. There's only really a few of them. It's almost like a pseudo cartel. But I think last year, the University of California system. The University of California. I mean, California is like the 5th largest economy in the world. Second, 5th under like the United Kingdom and the United States, right? So it's a gigantic state. It has a lot of very, very august institutions, UC Berkeley, UCLA, USC, right? These are gigantic institutions with a ton of people. And so therefore, these companies like Elsevier is one of the big ones, the company that owns Nature is one of the big ones, Science. This is a gigantic contract for them, right? Because it's all of these institutions. And so about a year ago, the UC system, the like head librarian basically said, you know what, you keep your subscription. We're not going to subscribe this time, which was wild. I mean, that's a huge, and it was with Elsevier, which is I think the biggest publishing company in the world. And then recently, I think like a couple days ago, MIT just did the same thing. So it's like a very big deal. I can't remember if Penn did something similar, but anyways, yeah, it's a very big deal. It really needs to change. I mean, it is just it's a super outdated system. So, okay. It's so wild. My dad pays to publish his articles too. I'm like, what? Yeah. And like, maybe you're like, okay, whatever, that's the system. Like, you want to get your science out there, right? Well, if I were publishing it in the New York Times or, whatever, some other publication, the Wall Street Journal, they'll pay me because they're getting my content, right? So so it is just nuts. I should have worked in publishing. I know, seriously. I was considering it for a hot second, but Ian, did you go through the dexamethasone paper? Not yet, no. I just saw the sort of the breakdown. And it was something like a third of patients improved much more rapidly following administration of that drug. Which, it does make sense. Like hydroxychloroquine, like there were rationales behind like thinking that might work. Dexamethasone makes a little bit more sense just because it's basically, rather than using a fishing pole or using a spearfishing, using a fish spear, whatever, one of those little spear guns that you use underwater. You are casting a net, right? So you're just like making it so that the whole immune system just calms down, and that can attenuate a lot of the severe components of COVID-19 for a lot of people. All right, Mom, her caregiver for dementia are positive for the virus. My 87-year-old dad isn't positive. What's the deal? Okay, Mom, I assume Mom and her caregiver for dementia are positive for the virus, and my 87-year-old dad isn't positive. It's tough to know. I obviously can't tell you for sure, but yeah, once again, I mean, there do seem to be some disparities in susceptibility to the virus that seem to or must have some basis in biology. There must be some biological explanation for why it is that some people just don't seem to be as vulnerable. It could be blood type, right? We talked about that a few times. A spear gun, thank you. Gosh. Yeah, my brain is melted. Yeah. So that's one potential explanation. Another could be, that like it just so happened that your father had been exposed to some coronavirus. That this coronavirus isn't the only one out in the wild. There are multiple coronaviruses. Most of them cause fairly trivial illnesses, although pretty much any illness is kind of a big deal for somebody at that age. But there are other coronaviruses that cause like sort of the common cold, basically. And so it could be the case that, and we don't know whether there might have been some therapeutic exposure to a similar enough virus that caused the secondary immune reaction to SARS-CoV-2, to COVID-19, to be more effective. And so people don't have as significant, don't have a reaction at all, or they don't have as significant an inflammatory reaction. That could be it. It could be that there's some kind of genetic polymorphism in the receptors with which SARS-CoV-2 has to interact, like again, TMPRSS2, ACE2. It could be the case that there's some polymorphism, some genetic difference between the forms of those proteins that render some people just far less likely to have significant exposures to SARS-CoV-2. There's also, the concern of the dose of exposure, right? These are all things that I've talked about on the YouTube, by the way, if you want to get into it. But where there, and this was thought might be an issue early on, but there's now some more evidence for it that like the bolus of exposure, like if you're exposed to many millions of SARS-CoV-2 particles, somebody sneezes in your mouth, which my baby has done to me. Not great. Fortunately, she doesn't have COVID-19, knock on wood. But whatever. Somebody coughs near you, on you, you inhale their respiratory droplets. You are likely to be exposed to far more COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 viral particles than somebody who just touched a doorknob, and that's somebody who sneezed on their hand, which you should sneeze into your elbow, by the way. A lot of people are learning a lot of good hygienic practices. Anyways, they touched it 10 minutes before, you touch it, and then you scratch your eye or something like that, and now you've been exposed. That's a far lower exposure. So there's sort of like a potential dose issue here. And so it could be the case that if that this caregiver and your mother, I suppose, or this person or these people have it, you can take mitigation, action, right? So you can limit their exposure. You can have them make sure they're always wearing masks. Make sure that you have hand sanitizer, stuff like that. Okay, how can you change neural networks? Well, Nesowitz, you have no choice in the matter. They're changing all on their own. The primary concern is hoping that they're changing in ways that yield long-term benefits, right? So that's why we go to school, right? That's why we value education. So the way you change those neural networks is you just sit there. But the question is what do you want to do with that superpower that the human brain has to change in reaction to experience? Okay. If someone sneezes in my mouth, they're going to the ER. Yeah, right. Oh, you might too, though, if they have coronavirus. Okay. All right. I should probably call it a day there. So thank you for watching, everybody. Thank you for joining and chatting with me. It's always my pleasure. I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. I go into greater depth on specific topics before I go live here. So you can check that out. Subscribe if you are so inclined. And if you're watching on YouTube, I would appreciate a subscription as well. Oh, wait. So somebody is. Okay, wait. Before I leave, I've neglected the YouTube comments. Hi, Ian. Just curious. What was your motivation goal to be a scientist pre-formal education? And now being a scientist, has your motivation goal changed overall? That's a deep topic. But initially when I first went to college, again, I'd never met a scientist. So my goal was to major in politics and economics. And the first 2 years of college, that's what I focused on. But then I took a class, and I had been raised. My parents were always very interested in science. We would discuss Richard Dawkins' latest book at the dinner table regularly. Also, my parents would require me to defend any kind of argument that I had about consciousness, even though I was a child, which is a fabulous exercise. I'm eternally grateful to them. And I had hobbies, mostly imparted by my mom, where we collected minerals together. She had this just amazing garden, we'll call it, that I helped to cultivate. And so I've always been interested in science. I just never thought I was good at it or could do it. I thought only geniuses can be scientists, let alone neuroscientists. And then I went to college, and on a whim, you have the opportunity to take some electives, right? So you don't have to only take the courses that are promoting your major. And so I took a brain and behavior course, and it was taught by a guy who almost got his PhD in literature, and he was just an excellent teacher. And that's I was always interested in questions like, okay, caffeine. Coffee is a stimulant. Why is coffee a stimulant? Oh, Pasha, I'm sorry. How rude of me. Well, shout out to Pasha. And so, I was always interested in questions of why is coffee, coffee is stimulating. Why is it stimulating? Well, it has a drug in it. What drug? Caffeine. Why is caffeine a stimulant? Well, it, binds a certain receptor, the adenosine receptor, by the way, and it prevents adenosine, a neurotransmitter, amino acid neurotransmitter, from binding its receptor, and that makes us less tired. But why is that stimulating? Why does that make us less tired? Well, that action then ends up in elevating catecholamine neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine. Okay, but why is that stimulating? And so you just go down this rabbit hole, and I do that. Right, I had those types of questions, and I was always interested in human behavior. That's why I wanted to major in politics. I thought politics was the discipline that is concerned with human behavior, and I found those classes extraordinarily agitating, frustrating, because there were no data that were being discussed. It was all just well, this old guy said this, and this old guy said this, and this political operative basically wrote this opinion about what we should be doing in the Middle East. That kind of stuff was just very frustrating to me. And I took this brain and behavior course, and it was no, we're talking about scientific evidence, and it's just very compelling. And after that course, and also I developed enough of a
specific interest in neuroscience that I thought maybe, even though I think only geniuses can do it, maybe if I put enough work in, I'll be able to do it. So then I took a neuropharmacology course, and that's when I decided, like, okay, I can do this for sure. I was taught by a guy named Thomas Borowski, this guy from, I believe, Saskatchewan in Canada. I think it's Saskatchewan. And he had like an accent right out of the Trailer Park Boys. Like, he had such a such a Canadian accent, or such a Saskatchewan accent. I think, is it Saskatchewan? I think so. Anyways, and he was just this charming, brilliant guy, and and so I decided, and then I just kept going, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to keep taking these classes until I can't anymore. And that's essentially what ended up happening. But yeah, and I came to realize this, something that I always harp on, which is not all scientists are geniuses. Like, most are not. The vast majority are not, right? Of course, there are some geniuses there in science, but the vast majority of us are just like any other profession. It's just we happen to have the privilege and the capability of focusing in on a topic on which vast majority of people have no opportunity to engage. So that is the medium length story. All right. No, I do work hard. So Steph Ray Arts. Definitely I work hard. But like, whenever you meet somebody who's doing a PhD in science, in any science, but particularly neuroscience, they are working really hard. Like, otherwise they would do something else. You don't get paid enough. The degree, doesn't result in a high enough income to justify it if you aren't willing to work really hard and you're not really interested in the subject. Study drugs. I have studied drugs. I've studied opioids, nicotine, alcohol, psychedelics. We are using it a lot to support our work in expressive therapies. Interesting. Ian was like, I'd rather listen to neurons than people's opinions on politics. I hear you. Although, yeah, we shall see what happens in a couple of weeks. I keep saying I might have a new job. I am told that I have this job, but just because of the nature of the job and the nature of the world right now, the universe, either their budget may be altered, or who knows, in 2020 we're going to be invaded by aliens and we're all going to have to just like live on their mothership and be in pods in some galaxy far, far away. Who knows what's going to happen? But in a couple of weeks I should have a new job. My dad has a PhD. Oh wait. My dad has a PhD, he's 65 and still writing papers. He works so hard, I don't know how he does it. That's awesome. Yeah. And that's another thing about academia is that, it's not like athletics, right? You can, stay in academics for as long as you want, really. The problem is that it's extraordinarily competitive, and it's just I don't think it would be ethical for me to do that now that I have a daughter, and maybe I'll have more kids, and if I have an opportunity to provide a better resources for her, I think I should do it. The Matrix, yeah. Everyone, please smash that like button. Yes, thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks, Cosmic Rose. I appreciate that. Yeah, so, okay, I'll close here. YouTube channel is youtube.com/anthropoid. I talk about more in-depth topics there if you want to check that out before the live stream. I have a podcast, Wired to be Weird. I have a bunch of things on, like, what are dreams? Why do we have them? What would it be like if, we had a whole brain-computer interface? And artificial intelligence. What is dementia? What is Parkinson's? Or what is addiction? So all those types of topics. So Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher, and I have a Patreon. If you are in a position, and these are tough times, I know for a lot of people, if you are in a position to be able to support this, I would appreciate it. Patreon.com/anthropoid. All right, and with that, I hear my baby wailing, so I will go to the baby. Thanks for joining. I'll see you next week. All right, so this is the awkward part where I haven't finished the YouTube yet. But anyways, I really appreciate the following on YouTube. I hope that I will soon be in a position to be able to do something a little bit more substantive, a little bit more coherent and efficient in the not too distant future. But like everybody else, time is tough literally just having enough time is tough right now. So thanks for watching. I appreciate the subscription if you enjoyed it. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See you guys.